Welcome, and thank you for joining our fifth and final panel discussion looking at U.S. electoral issues through the lens of the 2005 Carter-Baker Commission on Federal Election Reform. I'm John Williams, a fellow of the Presidential Elections Program at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. The Institute has organized this five-part series with the Carter Center. The Carter Center and the Baker Institute are nonpartisan organizations founded by former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James A. Baker. 16 years ago, President Carter and Secretary Baker came together to co-chair a bipartisan commission that made a series of recommendations about ways to build confidence in U.S. elections. Today, debate about electoral reform continues to rage. Americans are deeply divided, and politicians often seem more interested in exploiting those divides rather than in searching for common ground. In this context, we thought it important to bring together smart, reasonable people for constructive discussions about how we might be able to strengthen our electoral processes, and in doing so, ultimately strengthen our democracy. The title of today's discussion is Opportunities and Challenges of Election Reform. Our panelists are Michael Adams, Kentucky's Secretary of State; Jocelyn Kiley, Associate Director of the Pew Research Center; Charles Stewart III, the Keenum Suheen Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology; and Alejandro Tulio, Director of Legal Sciences at San Martin National University in Argentina. Once again, our moderator today is Doug Chapin, Director of Election Research at the Forrest Marsh Group. Doug also served as Director of Research in 2005 for the Carter-Baker Commission. After today's discussion, David Carroll of the Carter Center will offer a few closing remarks. But first, we're starting with this very short video. Thank you.
In 2005, the United States was in its fifth year of efforts to reform its election system. The hotly contested and controversial 2000 presidential election had identified flaws in the nation's registration and voting laws that were seen to contribute to a lack of confidence in election outcomes. A 2002 bill called the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, addressed some of those issues, but failed to settle all of the arguments that had arisen around election reform. For example, state laws requiring voters to provide photo identification were generating backlash amid claims of disenfranchisement. Worry about new voting technology was leading to fears of counting errors. And growing numbers of absentee and mail ballots were raising concerns about the possibility of fraud. In response, former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker III agreed to co-chair a bipartisan commission housed at Washington, D.C.'s American University to examine these and other outstanding election reform issues. The final report, entitled Building Confidence in U.S. Elections, stressed the important role of elections to the nation's democracy and made a series of recommendations, some controversial at the time, that sought to protect access to polls and the integrity of the election process. Today, many of the challenges that the Commission recognized have been addressed and are now familiar aspects of the American voting experience. Yet they remain central to current election reform debates. In this panel series, we are revisiting key issues in the Carter-Baker report and assessing how they can help foster constructive dialogue on election reforms. During today's webinar, titled Opportunities and Challenges for Election Reform, we will discuss nonpartisan election administration. On this issue, the 2005 Commission report said, to minimize the chance of election meltdown and to build public trust in the electoral process, nonpartisan structures of election administration are very important, and election administrators should be neutral, professional, and impartial. The Commission pointed to international experience in this area, noting that the trend in the world is toward independent election commissions composed of nonpartisan officials who serve independently of political parties or the executive or legislative branches. In the 16 years since the Commission issued its recommendations, the issue of nonpartisan election administration has continued to stay in focus. In today's discussion, we'll look more closely at this issue with a special focus on public opinion and how it affects efforts to promote nonpartisanship in a highly charged political landscape, keeping in mind the ultimate goal of building confidence in U.S. elections. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome or welcome back to our panel discussion of the Carter Center and the Baker Institute. Again, my name is Doug Chapin with the Forest Marsh Group in Northern Virginia, and I'm delighted to be, at least by association, with a group of smart and reasonable people today, drawn from some of the leading thinkers in the field, and today an international field of experts on the topic of nonpartisan election administration. Have really enjoyed the panels so far. The goal of this series, as was the goal of the Carter-Baker Commission, was to promote reasoned and bipartisan dialogue about important election issues, and we've been delighted with the response so far, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Quick tour through our logistics today. I'm going to start with an opening question to each one of our panelists to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and get the conversation started. We'll then move to a moderated discussion where I'll throw questions out to the entire panel and allow them to chew on them as they like. And then in the last, say, 15 minutes or so of the event, we'll turn to questions from the audience, which you can submit through the Q&A button there at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. We'll be collecting those to make sure that we cover as many of them as possible before we sign off close to 2:15 Eastern today. So again, welcome or welcome back. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with Secretary Adams. Secretary, the Commonwealth of Kentucky recently enacted a bipartisan reform bill to make changes to its voting laws. How did you manage this partisan environment, and what advice do you have for other states seeking to accomplish the same thing?
Well, thank you so much for including me today, and thank you for that question. I'm very proud of Kentucky. I think uniquely this year, as far as I know, we're the only state that's pulled this off. That's actually made it easier to vote and harder to cheat on a bipartisan basis, while other states are caught up in partisan warfare. I'm really proud of that. I think the special sauce that we found here is that we've learned that you can have access and security at the same time. That's certainly one of the premises of the Carter-Baker Commission report, and something I believe here, and we've seen actually work here. Last year, on a bipartisan basis, our legislature gave our Democratic governor and me, a Republican chief election official, joint emergency powers to make changes to the election system, to be able to safely accommodate voting during a pandemic. We implemented expanded absentee voting and in-person early voting. We had neither of those in Kentucky previously, and both of those were popular with Republicans and Democrats, and our turnout really shot up. So we've learned that you can have access and security simultaneously. But here's the real interesting thing. Actually, they reinforce each other. And let me give you two examples. With the early voting, a plurality of our voters last year voted early. In person and early. And what we found is not only did it make it easier to vote by having multiple days to vote instead of just one as we'd always had, we actually made the election more secure that way. I've got a bipartisan ballot integrity task force, and they reported back to me that the early voting helped reduce the number of irregularities that we typically had. We have vote fraud in Kentucky. It's not a myth. It's not widespread, certainly, but we do have occasional cases of vote buying out in the mountains where there's high poverty. It's harder to run a vote buying operation over multiple days. And it's easier for law enforcement to monitor an election for irregularities when it's happening in a smoothed up period of time of several days instead of just one day of frenetic chaos. So the early voting certainly improved access to the ballot, but it also enhanced security at the same time. Similarly, with our absentee voting, for the first time, we created a portal for voters to be able to bypass the paperwork, go online, and directly request an absentee ballot. That made the ballot certainly more accessible to voters, but it also enhanced our security. For the first time, those ballots could now be monitored electronically. Every voter could go online and see where that ballot was in the process. Had it been sent out? Had it been received back and cast and counted? So we had accountability there for the voter, but we also had the ability of me to surveil the election in real time and monitor for any lost or stolen ballots. And so those are just two great examples of how, on an administrative basis last year and now in this legislation on a permanent basis, we've made it both easy to vote and hard to cheat at the same time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And thanks again for being here. Looking forward to having you with us. today.
Excellent.
Let me turn next to Jocelyn Kiley from the Pew Research Center. Jocelyn, what does Pew's public opinion research say about Americans' attitudes toward voting policies and election administration? And specifically, is there a desire for nonpartisan election administration?
Sure. So we've tracked attitudes about aspects of the election process and voting for some time, and I think the story is that there are some areas of bipartisan in the public agreement about election policies. In fact, some of the very things that the secretary just noted, we find in our research. So, for instance, there's bipartisan support for expanded early voting, though Democrats, of course, are more likely to support this than Republicans. You find a majority of Republicans saying this as well. Similarly, you find that there's some support for automatic registration and some of the other proposals from the Carter-Baker initiative, and so public opinion does find some areas of bipartisan agreement in the public. I would say, though, we also find a fair amount of partisan disagreement, and I think that's the crux of a lot of the debates that we're seeing in the public and among political elites over the course of the last couple of years. And so there really isn't a clean story, though there are these opportunities for bipartisan efforts. One thing I also will point to is that we've seen a real shift in opinion on some of these dimensions. So for instance, absentee voting, really as recently as a couple of years ago, we saw about half of Republicans supporting this, as well as the majority of Democrats supporting expanded access to absentee voting. But we really did see a decline in the share of Republicans supporting expanded absentee access over the course of the last election. So there's that dynamic that's at play. With respect to the question about nonpartisan administration, that's actually a tough thing to ask about in public opinion, because there's broad support for bipartisan efforts, nonpartisan efforts. People like these things in the abstract. You ask, people if they want their politicians to collaborate and cooperate, and you find broad support for that. But when you get into the nitty gritty, you often find that that people also like for the people that they support to be in power, and that is not particularly true to this area of policy debate, but it certainly applies to debates around voting access, and voting administration, just as it does to any number of policy areas as well.
So you might say that nonpartisan election administration is like that famous observation that you should always compromise on principle, but fight to the death on details.
That's right. We have tons of research along this line, even around the issue of compromise and what compromise means. We often say compromise means to many people that I get 80% of what I want and you get 20% of what you want. So that can be tough when it actually comes to bipartisan compromise.
Wonderful. Well, thank you and welcome. Let me turn next to my friend and colleague, Charles Stewart from MIT. Charles, I know that for several cycles now, you and the team at MIT have conducted the survey of the performance of American elections. Can you talk a little bit more about what the survey is, and especially what it has said over time about Americans' attitudes toward partisanship in election administration?
You would think that after 15 months of doing this nonstop, I would not be that guy who doesn't unmute. I apologize. Thanks, Doug, and thanks to the Carter Center and the Baker Institute for sponsoring this important conversation. And the question is about what the survey of the performance of American elections, SPAE, tells us about voters' experience and what they expect about nonpartisan election administration. So for those who don't know, the SPAE is a survey that I've been putting into the field with my team since the presidential election of 2008. We interview at least 200 people in every state in the country, starting the day after Election Day. This year we were able to expand the sample, so we talked to over 18,000 voters immediately after Election Day to ask them about what their experience was. And we ask soup to nuts, things like, how hard was it to find your polling place? How good were the polling officials? How easy was it to vote on the machine? How easy was it for you to get your absentee ballot, et cetera. We also ask some policy questions very similar to what Pew asks about, questions about confidence and those sorts of things. And so what do we find, and how does it relate to nonpartisan election administration? The first thing I would say is actually not to answer the question directly, but to start from this question about voter confidence. Because I like to quip when people ask me, well, what causes voter confidence? I always like to say, well, we know from the research on which I've conducted that you can make voters confident by providing two things. You make sure that their voting experience was a good one, and you make sure that their candidate always wins. And if you get those two things, they'll be confident, right? So election administration, it's not about making sure particular people win, but it is about making the experience a good one. And so that's the area in which I think there's a lot of room for nonpartisan, and I would even say, being at MIT, scientific approaches to election administration. So the SPAE tells us that even in tough years, that most people, when they go to the polls, it's easy to find the polling place, they have a good experience, the poll workers do their job, the equipment is good, and all the rest, okay? Their line is short, etc. But there are some people who wait in long lines, who have lousy election workers. Small number, about 5%. But those are the voters who are dissatisfied. And that's where stories emerge that can brew discontent locally with the quality of the elections. So then as Jocelyn says, when you ask people what they like about election administration, they want it to be nonpartisan. But we also know that they want their experience to be a good one. And so how do you make sure their experience is a good one? And there I'll just pivot and close my remarks by noting that there have also been, in addition to kind of public opinion work in the scientific realm, there's been real engineering, scientific, management-related work in polling places to basically apply what we know in management science to the running of polling places, apply what we know about design techniques to the design of ballots. And those sciences, those arts and crafts, shorten lines, make ballots more easy to follow, make instructions easier to follow, voters make fewer mistakes, and at the end of the day, they're more confident. And we as voters are more confident that the results are based on the will of the people and not based on, the whim of a machine that broke down or something like that. So it's a long way of saying we hear from the polls that people like good election administration. And there will be sometimes disagreement about what that means, but it is important to note that a lot of time there's not disagreement. And if we can give election officials the space and the equip them to apply best principles, that's a really good thing.
Thank you very much. I'm always reminded of to paraphrase that old economics text, and what we need to focus on is elections as if people mattered. And if we give them good experience, they will have good things to think about the process. Great. Well, thank you for being here. And last but absolutely not least, let me turn to Alejandro Tulio. As someone who's worked in elections around the world, what lessons does the international experience have for American efforts to achieve nonpartisanship in election administration?
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here and try to give my views on 20 years of involvement in election management. Building confidence in elections needs confidence in every process of the organization of the elections, and that relies on the professionality and the confidence in the electoral administration and the electoral managers. I believe that in the last 30 years in Latin America, we have evolved from dictatorships to more or less fully democratic countries, in part by the ruling of clear processes of selection of our governments. Elections are fair, elections are usually well conducted, and that relies on a common ground of laws that are very clear, a common law, a uniform law in all the country, in every country of the region, and electoral management bodies that are fully engaged with and commit with the democratic process. I believe that in a lesson, as in the States, in the United States, elections are managed at state level. We must try to go towards non-partisanship in the electoral management bodies by means of state laws that create electoral boards, electoral management boards. That boards must divide in the law. There must be a division between the nomination process from the appointment process. The nomination process must be on the hands of universities, in the case of lawyers, maybe the bar, or grassroots NGOs commit with democratic processes or with public affairs. And that nomination must be a very open process. Then the legislator must be the appointed authority. A bipartisan committee in the legislation must select and assess the legislator in order to appoint people that are fully independent, with no ties with the government, with the administration, and no ties with political parties. We must prevent conflict of interest from the political parties, from the administration, or from any subject that may impact on the electoral process. I believe that the confidence of the people is proportionally to the publicity of this process. A public appointment process, open nomination activity may contribute to non-partisanship in not only in the nomination or the appointment, but also in the work of the committee, in the work of the board. It's very important that the board delivers its work in a non-partisan way. And that is what contributes to rebuild confidence, lost confidence in electoral processes.
Thank you very much, and welcome. Looking forward to having you with us today. Let me start our discussion with something that Secretary Adams brought up at the outset. This notion deeply ingrained in the entire Carter-Baker process and the final report, that the concepts of access and integrity are not only not in conflict, but actually can benefit one another. Just to the panel generally, how might developments in expanding nonpartisan election administration actually help further both of those goals? And this is free play. I won't call on anyone, but I'll feel free to get us started if anybody's got a thought.
Well, I'll chime in real fast. Let me give you just one more example, and then I'll wrap it up into your last question. So we added a cure process in Kentucky last year, administratively first, and now through legislation, a cure process such that if the voter mails in an absentee ballot, we do verify signatures against the voter registration card of that voter. The last major election before I got to office, the state threw out 7.5% of those ballots and never notified the voters. That's scandalous to throw out that proportion of votes and not inform the voters. With the cure process, we actually now contact those voters if there's a mismatch of their voter registration card and their absentee ballot envelope. But this benefits access and security. It potentially re-enfranchises people who, through no fault of their own, have seen their signature change over time. But it also gives me a lead on potential vote fraud if there's been a case where the voter says that wasn't me, there was impersonation. But I think there's a real political angle to this too. You've got to be able to sell access to Republicans and sell security to Democrats. And so the way I've done it in Kentucky, at least, is is by explaining that we can give you what you want without you actually sacrificing anything. No one in our legislature, when they were debating this bill, had to feel that they gave up anything. They didn't have to give up any security to get access, and they didn't have to give up any access to get security. So I think the real key here is, number one, start with a bipartisan process. We made a point to get everybody around the table, the governor, county clerks of both parties, legislators of both parties, me, and sit down and hash it out and make sure everyone's interests and concerns were addressed. So from the outset, it was a bipartisan process. That led to a better product. There's no question about it. But it also led to a better look. And I think this is a really important point, too. It doesn't have to be, in my view, apolitical or nonpartisan to be fair and respected by the public universally, but at least it has to be bipartisan. If we can't get that far, at least it needs to be bipartisan. I think the most important thing we did last year was people saw the governor and me together at press conferences agreeing on the changes. And so the Republicans felt like, well, it must be legit. Adams is signing off, and the Democrats thought it's legit. The governor's signing off. That's a really important thing here. Even if the substance doesn't change at all, the look has to be right. And that's the biggest problem with what's going on today in Texas, what's going on in Georgia, Florida, and some other states is there's a bad look, even if the bills are perfectly fine. And some I think are fine and some are not, but even if the bills are all perfectly fine, the look is terrible. It looks like one party is trying to take over the system. And I would suggest it's the same problem in Washington with HR 1 and S1. It looks like the Democrats are trying to take over the system. You just cannot have partisan election legislation and laws. It's got to be bipartisan from the very outset. And it's got to be communicated by representatives of both sides to the public saying this is a good deal for everybody.
If I could jump in and add to pile on what the secretary was talking about. I mean, there's a couple of other reforms that are out and about, and that I think at the core of them are about the simultaneous achievement of security and access. One is automatic voter registration, which is the way of basically having the state register people when they interact with government, most notably through driver's license facilities, but also sometimes through social service agencies, et cetera. And one of the reasons why that's it's kind of obviously an access issue, but it's also a security issue. Because it turns out that the driver's license department is very interested in a bunch of things, including, for instance, citizenship for real ID. The same with social service agencies. They can only give benefits to people who are citizens in most states. And then finally, and that interaction usually, the potential voter, along with a caseworker or a clerk, is very intent on getting all the information down right. And so by streamlining that process, you have fewer mistakes on the one hand, and on the other hand, you get more people into the system. Okay, that's one example. Another example is an organization called ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is a consortium of states who join to share their voter registration information and related information, for instance, driver's license records, so that states themselves can sort out who's moving around, who needs to be removed from this role, potentially removed from this role because they moved over here. But part of that system is not only the maintenance of the voter rolls, the trimming of dead wood, making sure people aren't double registered, but also has a provision in which it's also possible to reach out to people that you discover who are eligible but not registered. And so there's that aspect of it too. So there's all sorts of things like that out there in the world. Sometimes they're grand bargains, as it happened in Kentucky, it's happened in other places. Sometimes it's embedded within a particular reform, and it's actually really quite surprising the number of those reforms that are like that.
I agree with Secretary Adams that electoral law must be a common heritage, so must be bipartisan. That is the proper path towards integrity in elections and fair elections. And if you believe that integrity is that everyone who is entitled to vote can vote, and anyone who is not entitled to vote may vote, In the first case, an opportunity. In the second case, a prohibition and an impossibility. Fair elections must be 3 out of 3, secure, competitive, and accessible. There would not be competitive if they aren't accessible and if they aren't secure. There won't be secure if anyone who wants to vote has an obstacle, an improper and illegitimate obstacle. And accessibility is a sign of the times also. In a polarized country, accessibility is one of the healing procedures towards avoiding polarization.
I'll step in and talk a little bit also. I think it's important. Some of these themes are themselves up for debate in this polarized country. So even this core question about whether elections that you can make it easier to vote, make more access, and not trade off security. We ask a question that asks people whether, in fact, there's a trade-off there or not. And the majority of Americans say there isn't, but there's a big partisan divide on that, where Democrats overwhelmingly say there's not a trade-off, whereas Republicans are more split, more likely to say that making access easier is necessarily a trade-off for security. So I think, to the extent that one of the points is to talk about finding things to communicate about in a bipartisan way, one question is messaging around that this tenet, that if the belief from both Democrats and Republicans is that you can have secure elections and broader access, then there's a messaging and a bipartisan effort that needs to happen around that, because at least in the public, you do not see bipartisan agreement on that question. So I think that's an important thing to think about. And then I also think you see it in a lot of these other examples. Charles touched on a number of areas that maybe, outside of the bright lights of politics, you can probably find a lot of bipartisan agreement. Republicans and Democrats finding areas of election administration that they can agree would be good reforms. And yet, in the scrutiny of the public, you find a lot of polarization around these issues. And so the question, I guess this is really outside of what I do at the Pew Research Center. The question is there a way to remove these debates from the spotlight of politics and have what in the past might have been considered backroom discussions in order to have some of these grand bargains, because these discussions are so hyperpolarized.
And that actually segues into my next question. I think that's, given that we do see that split, what do folks on the panel think is necessary to find a way through the current intense partisan battles over these issues? How do we get to the kinds of grand bargain that we've seen in Kentucky, or consensus that we hope to see in other states? We know where we want to be. We know where we are. We just need to figure out how to get from here to there. Any thoughts?
I'll throw out one more. One of my favorite little technical statistical points that I used to try to get my bill passed was I noted that in 2020, with the expanded voting options that we offered, the proportion of vote cast by Republicans was about the same, and by Democrats was about the same as it was in 2019, the year before when I was on the ballot. In 2020, we had our highest turnout ever. We only had 42% turnout in 2019, but the results came out the same. The same counties voted the same way by the same margins, even though the turnout was up about 1.5 times. And so what I've tried to convey to legislators and others as well, but especially legislators, is adopting these procedures doesn't help Democrats. It doesn't hurt Democrats or Republicans. It just helps the voters. The games are going to be played, and the games are going to come out the same way, one way or the other. But this is good for the voters. And the voters, of course, told their legislators they liked these things that we did. They told local officials. Local officials also lobbied for them. But I think at the outset, if you can try to prove this, then give it a shot, that the results aren't going to be changed. Nobody wants to go vote for a bill to help the other side win, right? You can persuade legislators to do things that aren't necessarily in their interest, but you can't persuade them to do things that are not in their interest. They're rational and they're political. If you can at least show them with the data that the games are going to be played and they come out the same way, even if you expand voting, or flip it to the security stuff, whether it's voter ID or cleaning up the voter rolls or whatever it is. If you can persuade on that side Democrats that they're going to be treated fairly, they're not going to lose votes or lose elections because of what you're doing, they'll accept it. So the real key is, can you find things that make things better for the voters and don't harm the political interests of either side? That's a win-win. And those things are very, very doable.
And so, if I could jump in there, I think, I to some degree, and it bears directly on this point, that to some degree, I think we are victims of the rhetoric about the promises and the fears about policy change or reform in the elections arena. And that is to say, reformers, I think, overclaim the salutary effects, especially on turnout, that comes with reform. And that opponents of reform are, in a sense, kind of believe that, or, kind of take their cues from the folks who are pushing the reform and believe that, there must be a big partisan advantage to that reform. And I think we in political science and in this larger field of election science have done a horrible job in communicating the facts, the evidence, such as Secretary Adams is pointing out, is that at the most, for any of these reforms, you maybe sometimes will see a point shift here, point shift there, but that the cacophony of the campaigns swamps all of that in almost every case. If you want a reform that really had a huge effect, look at the Voting Rights Act. And that took 20 years to have really significant changes in terms of the composition of the electorate. Anything else is going to be in the noise of all of politics. And I think that academics like myself have to just do a better job of communicating what we know about kind of the turnout effects, the effect on the composition of the electorate as a consequence of reforms, and to try to turn the conversation back to this issue of the experience for the voters.
Justin or Alejandro, want to give you a chance to jump in if you'd like. If not, I can keep
just a comment. It is not a problem of the United States. It's a problem of human nature. In discussing electoral laws, it's discussing the nature of power and the construction, the engineering of the construction of power. So it's reasonable that no one can give the other an advantage. So it's very important that knowledge prevails over the myth. There are many myths around elections. There are many urban legends around election administration and how can you put out some votes and how can you manage knowledge, clear laws, standardized procedures, quality management. Electoral administration is usually disregarded or at least underrated in the academy and in politics. But voter registration, the design of ballots, technology issues, all of that is in the core of election administration. We must put a light on this. We must focus. A voter-centered approach to electoral reform is an approach that puts election administration in the center of the ring, and everyone can see what is happening. The turnout is very important, and you must try to push people to participate. That's early voting, remote voting, but you must put aside all the myths around that these benefit Democrats, these benefit Republicans. in every country, it happens the same. In Latin America, when we came from highly polarized and violent societies, we tried to reach consensus by a strong bipartisanship in the negotiation in back channels, with back channels of electoral law. But the negotiation must be discreet, but the outcome must be very public and explained, not only by the authors, by the people involved in electoral dispute, but by the academy. There is a very, very important role of the political science and law professors, law teachers, to make civic education around the more problematic issues of electoral administration.
Thank you, Alejandro. I actually want to turn to something that you talked about a little bit earlier. So the Carter Baker Center, or the Carter Baker Report, endorsed a concept of independent election administrators, drawn largely from international experience, that operate outside of political party influence and formally outside of the executive or the legislature. Wanted to ask the panel generally, given the current nature of American election administration, which is not only decentralized, but very closely tied to state and local government, is there a path from here to there? Assuming that is a desirable outcome, how might we make the case to states and localities and the national government that such a structure is desirable and even possible? That's what our parents used to call the $64,000 question, but I'll just toss that out there. And can we get to something that looks more like an independent election administration sphere from the current scheme here in the United States?
Well, maybe I'll jump in. I'll leave the nitty gritty to the others on the panel, but I'm struck by a thing that is a factor here is how independent people will be perceived, and whether even the perception of independence is possible. And I say that I think you can come at that from a number of different ways, but we are also in an era of deep distrust in institutions and government, and in among some segments of the public, among elites, right? And an independent commission would necessarily be a commission of experts, and again, I'll leave the practical politics to others and the nitty gritty of how this might work. But I do think selling that independence is maybe not terribly easy to certain segments of the public. And even though, as I said, in broad strokes, I do think, Americans will express support for a nonpartisan election administration. We haven't asked that specifically, but, a related topic area is obviously around redistricting. And we've asked a question around redistricting recently, and we find much more people support the notion of nonpartisan redistricting commissions. And I think that would largely, that opinions about election administrations would largely parallel that. So, but I guess I do think there would be a little bit of concern of sort of independent in name only, right? That any commission might be captured by one or another partisan group. And so those are some of my thoughts.
A couple of thoughts. One is just the cautionary tale of Wisconsin. Which I think most people in this business would agree had the closest thing we were likely to get in this country to such an independent election authority, an elections board that was appointed on a nonpartisan basis, retired judges, and it got caught up in a partisan kerfuffle, and it's not independent anymore. And so that's one thought. There is this cautionary tale, and I think it's consistent with what Jocelyn was saying. On the other hand, this last election got me thinking that we might have more independent election administration than we think. But we have to think about the system more broadly than the election authority. And here I'm thinking about what I call the fact-based institutions who are responsible for communicating about and deciding the outcome of the 2020 election. When they were called on to make decisions, they made decisions based on facts. Oftentimes those were the election boards, many of whom were elected and operated on a partisan basis. But nonetheless, the basis of rule of law in the United States hems in what even partisan election boards themselves can do. And attempts to run around those fact-based institutions in election boards gave rise to court cases. And roughly 50 judges of all sorts had a simple question: what are your facts? If you don't have any facts, get out of here. And so at the end of the day, that fact-based system prevailed. It was based on the rule of law, but it wasn't entirely the election authority. So as we answer this question, I think we have to ask about the layer of institutions we have in this country and their ability to decide elections based on facts. I think that is under attack, and I mean it's a little wobbly right now, but on the other hand, I think it's more robust. It proved to be more robust in 2020 than some people were worried that it would be. So sorry for hijacking your question, but I think we might actually be closer to it without actually having it.
I think that's a really interesting observation. In fact, you can make the case that that in some ways the fact that our election authorities in most places are technically independent of the judiciary, but were in essence backstopped by the judiciary, suggests that we do still have a nonpartisan, or as you say, fact-based foundation for election administration in this country. Want to toss it out to the rest of the panel? Anybody else have thoughts? I've got lots of questions. So
I repeat the model. I believe in state electoral management boards integrated by independent members appointed by the legislator, uniform electoral rules and procedures to the county managers appointed by the electoral board, and first, very important, accountability of the work of the electoral boards, of the electoral board. Criminal prosecution for misconduct, very clear that is a very high responsibility, needs a very high standard of integrity, and that any misconduct will be criminally prosecuted. Must not be a possibility of the district attorney, of the state attorney to prosecute or not. Electoral misconduct must be a criminal prosecutor and have a criminal liability. And I think that a national mechanism of coordination between all states in central issues like voting technology, and I know that the voter registration database is state-based, but must be a link, an interoperability and a link between them in order to unsubscribe people that goes out from a state and communicate to the state where now reside that you have one more eligible voter in your state. I think that the courts must inform that mechanism of coordination about felons, about convictions, about any decision that may impact on the voter eligibility. I know that it's very complex in a federation, in the framework of the United States Constitution, but it's possible. And if it is possible, you can try to push forward.
Terrific. So let me ask another question. I'm going to start. We've talked a lot about this notion of nonpartisanship as if we know exactly what that is. But the 2005 report, I'm going to make sure I'm reading this right, noted that election administrators should be neutral, professional, and impartial. And I'm going to ask a question that I know is near and dear to Charles's heart, but I'd like to hear what other folks have to say about that. How might we measure this notion of neutrality, professionalism, and impartiality? And who should set those standards?
Doug mentioned being I'll start, but only to give my colleagues a chance to think about the answer. I mean, you mentioned the possibility of measuring, and so you've roped me in. The one I'll focus on is professionalism, and I mean that's one actually that so measurement. Well, let me talk about professionalism and then maybe some measurements. I think one of the consequences of the Baker Commission and several commissions like it, and several organizations like the Pew Center on the States, another Pew organization, have helped move election administration toward a more professionalized path. 20 years ago, we talk a lot about how election administrators are giving out dog licenses and all sorts of other things, and they kind of pick it up on the side. But that's less often. That's less often true. You more likely have technocratic people who have backgrounds in other fields. I'm a big fan of Secretary Adams's election director, who has a very strong kind of engineering background, process-oriented background, thinks about things in a systematic way. And so although it's not a profession in the sense that law or accountancy are, it's still profession in the sense, increasingly a profession in which there are standard operating procedures. There are standards like Alejandro talks about, coordinating between the states in terms of what's the right best practice, regardless of where you are, those sorts of things. That is growing in America. And I think we need more of it. And so in terms of metrics, well, I don't know, more people getting certificates from, say, a certain program in Minnesota would be one measure, or in Auburn, other places, right? I mean, there are professional certificates that people can get, and so drawing people from the professions that manage big operations, and education in the area, having more people educated in this area, I think would be one metric. And my guess is if we could measure 2005 versus 2021, we would see big increases on that dimension.
I want to jump in if I can. This recommendation from the report, I think, is directly tied to another recommendation that we're not talking about yet, at least, which is that the states should centralize this. Even if a state can find neutral, qualified experts to run things at the state level, unless you centralize election administration at the state level, then you've also got to have county officials who are capable of this. Here in Kentucky, we have 120 counties, and they all elect their county clerks, and the county clerks by law are the chief election officials of their counties. Most of these folks, if they have a degree at all, it's a high school degree. They're not trained in election administration in any formal way. They're local politicians. They were the high school quarterback or whatever in their communities, and that's how they got elected. And so we can't take this without going to the next step and doing the rest of it. But let me offer maybe a dissenting view from the report's recommendation. I think having accountability at the ballot box of people like me outweighs us being appointed nonpartisan experts, as it were. And here's a couple of reasons. One of them is I don't accept the premise that you are going to have partisanship in this office if you have a partisan person elected to hold the office. I challenge you to find a Secretary of State of either party in my state or anywhere who has been overtly political in the job, who hasn't aspired to be apolitical and fair, almost judicial in this role. I can't think of a lot of examples of bad actors in that sense. And almost all of us are elected at the ballot box by party. So a point that was made earlier by others is we actually largely already have nonpartisan administration in a lot of ways. But number one, I think these people have got to be accountable to the voters. And here's another point. I think you do better in this job if you have the political skills that come from running for office. the biggest responsibility that I had in 2020 and this year in trying to get a bill passed was communicating with the public, communicating with the media, with legislators, with everybody, and selling these ideas, selling expanded access, selling the program, knowing the technology certainly, but also being someone who was capable of communication on a broad scale. And I had to rely on my political skills that I honed as a candidate for office. I just don't know that you would have that same impetus coming from nonpartisan experts, if they'd be as influential in getting positive change brought or not, or as effective in calming the public's fears. I think it kind of helped that I was a Republican when most of the people who were dubious of the changes, in our state at least, were Republicans. I felt like I had a little bit more street cred when I called out false allegations of susceptibility to fraud in our election system with the changes that we made. So obviously there's great arguments on both sides, but put me down as in favor of keeping that part of our system.
And I will note that research does suggest that voters feel the same way in many ways. They do like the ability to elect their election officials precisely for the accountability that you suggest. So I often talk about nonpartisanship being not in how you get the job, but how you do the job. And so thinking about how to measure folks against that kind of a standard is incredibly important. Alejandro?
If you allow me, I don't want that my remarks on independence of the members of the electoral management body is taken as a demonization of the partisan appointed officials. I think that the Secretary of State will not go out of the responsibilities of the institutional responsibilities of the elections. But I believe that the management and the organization of the elections must be conducted by independent members with a professional staff. But the responsibility of putting forward a bill, electoral laws, the reform in itself is a responsibility of the Secretary of State, because it's a political question. Electoral issues are political questions in the best of the concepts of political questions. But electoral management must be a professional work. That I want to clarify that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Charles?
I was going to add on to that with
Please
all
do.
due respect to the Secretary of State we have on the panel. I think it's fair to say, and he would say so as well, is that in every state there is a professional director of elections, and in almost every state that professional director of elections survives turnover in party control, certainly in whoever the top person in office is. And I think actually this is a really important point that is missed on the public, a lot of activists, a lot of journalists, that so in some way, I mean, there's a really important, I agree entirely, there's a really important political role to be played by the Secretary of State as basically the political leader, giving gravitas and legitimacy to what's happening in the state. But there's also a lot more kind of neutral, best management, best practices, professionalism going on in most states than I think most voters know, and most of the public know. And that's something I wish we could emphasize. Yeah, I mean, that's a story that just hasn't been told enough. And I think goes a long way toward helping to achieve kind of a politics neutral administration of elections.
So actually, that's a nice lead into the last of my questions. One constant theme that we've had throughout all of the panels is this notion of policymakers driving reform these days rather than folks in the election community. I'm curious what any or all of you think about the notion that while we do see reforms moving through political bodies like legislatures, to what extent should those reforms be at least run by and consulted with election officials, if not actually driven by election officials. And I'm not just talking about meta issues of election administration, but just any issue in the election sphere. Is there and should there be a role for election officials in helping to shape the rules under which they operate?
Well, as an election official, I'm going to say yes. But in our state, we got the county clerks at the table. We got the election directors, me, obviously at the table, and we wrote this starting with them. And then, obviously, of course, we added legislators and others, and heard from interest groups and so forth. But we began with a product that was drafted by election officials. The very beginning of this was me surveying all 120 of our county clerks. What do you want to see in this bill? And that was the big picture stuff like early voting and so forth, but it was also the little technical suggestions they had. So I think the election officials absolutely have to be right at the table at the very beginning. You'll get a better product that way. And it'll also be seen as less political by either side if it's been written by the experts instead of politicians on one side or the other. It makes a big difference. And let me add a little unfortunate note. I won't name names for obvious reasons, but I can tell you that we should not assume that state legislators have any more understanding of the election system than the average constituent. I have a lot of legislators who believe a lot of conspiracy theories. They saw stuff on Facebook. They saw a meme. They saw a rumor, and they believe it just like any other constituent would. And these are our policymakers. So we've got some, of course, that this is true in every state. Some are absolutely outstanding, and some are literally representative of their constituents' views. And so certainly you got to have your legislators at the table, but we should always start with the election officials.
Well, I'm going to take off my neutral hat and say that's another reason that makes Kentucky somewhat unusual in recent events. And if we could see more election officials being, if not in the driver's seat, at least somewhere in the vehicle as it moves forward, that would be fantastic. Anyone else?
Well, I think it's tricky. I agree entirely. I think election officials are, on the whole, undervalued in these discussions, and particularly the more politicized things, the more they may get shut out. And we've seen this, I think, in Florida, for instance, where election officials almost unanimously pushed back with limited success against what was happening there. Georgia actually is kind of interesting. There were some kind of good government things that got into the Georgia bill because of election official involvement. It's tricky in the sense that, there's one election official for every, kind of local jurisdiction in America, depending a county or a municipality. And so, the kind of the median election official is overseeing a really small jurisdiction with very few voters. And so there are dynamics in many states where in normal times, election law, to the degree that it does rely on election officials, is aimed at pleasing small to medium-sized jurisdictions and doesn't always go to where the voters are. And I think that's the trick in state and national efforts for reform, is to balance, the disparate, everything from, in Massachusetts, from Cuttyhunk Island, Gosnold, with 23 voters, to the city of Boston with hundreds of thousands of voters, and Texas, which has the largest and even larger disparity between Harris County and Loving County. And so so we have to balance that. And so yes, absolutely, they need to be in the car, and under certain circumstances they need to be driving the car, and in other circumstances, other forces need to say, well, we're not there yet, right? So it really depends then on the specific issue you're talking about how much deference to election officials, but certainly there needs to be more most of the time.
But it is certainly true that if you're not on the, if you're not on the agenda, you're on the menu. And I think election officials have found themselves on the menu far too often lately. Well, let me go. I have a really good question from the audience, and it's for Alejandro, but I'm actually curious what everybody thinks. We can start with him. Is there a reason that elections should be managed by a multi-member board in the way that you describe, rather than just an individual appointed in the same way?
Independence doesn't grant knowledge and experience in these matters. So by a question of responsibility or accountability of the work of the electoral organization, I believe in boards, not in individual appointments. I was chief electoral officer of a national level in Argentina. I managed the elections in the whole country with millions and millions of voters and hundreds of thousands of ballot boxes. But I don't think that's a good experience. It's it's a very, very big responsibility in the shoulders of one person that may apply correctly the law, but may have his own interpretations. So have a context of discussion and a way of collective decision must be may grant a better outcome.
And just to follow up on that, in many states, as Charles and others have noted, there is a staff of people who persist from administration to administration. Might that staff, in the absence of the ability to appoint multiple members of a board, at least be a source of that kind of expertise? I guess I'm just thinking, living here in the DC area, how often you see vacancies on boards, which result in gridlock or inability to act. I'm wondering if having a single person supported by a staff could at least be an approximation, if not inequality, with the kind of structure you imagine.
Maybe a temporary solution. I served under 5 presidents. My position was appointed by the president, and I served under 5 presidencies. It was an extraordinary issue. I was a politician first, and then I became an electoral administration, a neutral electoral administrator. So maybe there are people in the staff that may guarantee neutrality, professionalism, etc. But that is a temporary, from my point of view, a temporary solution, because political parties and the legislator must arrive to an agreement, a bipartisan agreement, to select and appoint the correct people in this mechanism of management. Also, the Secretary of State, that at the end of the day is the final responsible of the electoral issues in the state, also may appoint a kind of intervention temporarily.
Well, actually, thank you for bringing up the issue of Secretary of State. I had a question from the audience. This is kind of a rip from the headlines, Law and Order style. We've seen reports recently of secretaries of state announcing their candidacies for other offices in elections where, at least technically, they would be overseeing their own election. How should that be handled? How is it handled around the world? And what might voters think about that? And I'm going to put speed round rules on everybody because we're coming up at the end of our time together.
Well, I can tell you how it was handled in Kentucky. My 2 immediate predecessors both ran for the U.S. Senate while they were Secretary of State, and they presided over their own defeats. And neither one was successful, and no one seriously contended that they were trying to get any sort of inappropriate advantage from the fact that they were the chief election officials. I mean, even if you're not running for a higher office, if you're running for re-election, if this is an office where you can retain the incumbent, then you're going to have a situation where, for example, I can preside over my own re-election. I don't see that as any different. So if you're going to have people able to run for an office, then you're always going to have this issue. I think Virginia is the only state now where they have one term and you're out. And it used to be even their attorney general, if he ran for governor, he'd have to resign as attorney general to run because of conflicts. But that's highly unusual. And you've not really seen corruption in the election system around the country and the states like Kentucky that allow the Secretary of State to be a candidate for this office or another one.
Well, I'm duty bound to report that Virginia is unique and wonderful in many ways, and that's just one of them. Anybody else on the panel?
I will just remark that it does seem to me unusual. If you take my argument earlier, that one of the strengths that was revealed in this last election was kind of the fact-based, quasi-judicial nature of our election system. That there's not either some requirement or norm of recusal, at least, when decisions affect people running, which actually is different from resign to run, right? I mean, and that actually might be a reasonable middle ground from requiring secretaries of state to step down, and would argue in favor of having some legal authority in all states that was multi-headed to deal with disputes that arise rather than having them land on a single person. So there could be different ways of dealing with this issue without a resign to run requirement.
I'll just add, I think there's the sort of question about policy-wise, what's the right thing to do? And then there's a question of how this affects how the public views elections and election integrity. And so I think it's very possible to oversee one's own election, but I also think it's really particularly incumbent on people to keep in mind how that colors the way voters might feel about the integrity of the process.
Well, very good. Well, I would really one more time want to thank the panel today for their remarks and for their incredibly thoughtful answers to my seemingly interminable questions. But you all have, it's really been a pleasure having all of you. We really appreciate taking the time to share with me and the audience today. With that, I will thank our panelists and I will turn things over to David Carroll of the Carter Center to play us out. David?
Thank you, Doug. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody in the audience for watching, and also to our excellent panelists for yet another great discussion in this series. It's been great. Before closing, I'd just like to say a few quick words of thanks to everybody at the Baker Institute and the Rice University for this really excellent collaboration, John Williams and Mark Jones in particular, and colleagues at the Carter Center who have done a lot of the heavy lifting to put this all together. Most importantly, Avery Davis Roberts and Soya Ellison. To our audience, if you missed any of the previous sessions, we'd like to point out that you can see video recordings at either the Carter Center or the Baker Institute YouTube channel. So we hope you'll have a chance to check in on those. And lastly, looking forward, the Carter Center and the Baker Institute we will produce a final report on this series and the main takeaways that we can identify. And we're hoping that there'll be other opportunities for us to work together and maybe to bring in some of the past panelists, hopefully all the past panelists in some way or another. We really appreciate all your sharing your insights. It's been really helpful to all of us as we think about the state of democracy here in our country. So please look at both of our websites going forward. We'll make information available about our future plans. And then in the meantime, stay healthy, get your vaccinations if you haven't already, and follow official public health guidelines. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate it.